So before I start, I would like to thank Dr. Lambrini Rori and Dr. Irin Karamouzi, the organizers of the seminar series, for inviting me to speak. I would also like to thank the British School at Athens and Professor John Bennett for hosting and coordinating the event, and Dr. Skleparis that is going to comment on the presentation. So my presentation today is part of my work that will be published in my book, entitled The Migration Security Nexus, in a couple of months by Papazissis Publishers in Greece. Also today, it's a great opportunity to interact and exchange ideas as I'm embarking into the new research project relevant to today's discussion, entitled The Geopolitics of Migration, Greece as a Receiving and Transit State, funded by the Leventis Foundation, to which I am ever grateful for the support. So the structure of my presentation is as follows. First, I will present the theoretical framework and research rationale. Second, I will analyze the migration security nexus in Greece. Third, I will place the analysis within the EU context. And fourth, in my concluding remarks, I will offer some research results. So this presentation looks at the migration and asylum management through the lens of the securitization theory, and also problematizes the political theory of Giorgio Agamben in order to shed light on the rationale of detention as a population management method and the elimination of fundamental freedoms that citizens take for granted. A key element of securitization is the characterization of a subject or an entity, like a social group, as an existential threat that needs emergent action. The language and the way it is used plays a significant role in the social construction of security, as well as the extraordinary measures that need to be taken for addressing the security threat. Agamben discusses the reduction of human life to a better life, as he calls it, and his analysis is important in understanding the exclusionary politics of asylum and assists in conceptualizing how processes of securitization and criminalization lead into the processes of dehumanization. So the main research questions that drive my work is firstly, whether migration has been securitized in Greece, that is, if it has been formulated and addressed as a security threat. And secondly, which are those mechanisms that result to the securitization of migration, that is, how this process has been coming about. So I will give an overview of how the public discourse and the migration policies have developed since the 90s in Greece, and this will give also a picture of the interrelationship between migration and security. And observing at migration laws and the political discourse in the 90s, Greece was not an immigrants receiving country. The increasing numbers of immigrants exemplify also the denial of the reality, and in a way the downplaying of the phenomenon as something transient, a fact that is reflected in the policies lacking a long-term goal. During the 90s, the framing of the immigrant in the public space as a criminal was depicted in legal documents and in political and media discourse. In particular, media played a significant role in connecting the influx of Albanian migrants with the perceived increase of criminality. In the mid-90s, some changes became visible with regards to the legal framework and also public discourse. For example, the presidential decrees signified an important change as the legalization of undocumented migrants entered the political agenda, and intense dialogue about racism and xenophobia developed in the public sphere, and also there were political actions for arranging the problem. These developments marked the inscription of the subject in the governmental agenda. Up until then, there was a social and political consensus about the unwanted migrants. So from 2000 onwards, a shift can be observed in the way that the migrants are treated by the media and the political discourse and the public policies. And the migrant is not regarded anymore as a foreigner, but as the economic migrant. In addition, the alteration of migration as a central stake of political confrontation evinces the importance of migration within political competition and denotes the high prioritization of the subjects in the political agenda. So the slow changes taking place in the legislative and public policy framework, also beginning of 2000 and mid-2000s, exemplify this realization that for the need of a solid strategy towards migration. Also, social dynamics like non-governmental organizations push towards this modification of the way that the migrants are framed. Within the public sphere, the criminalization of the illegal migrant gives its place to the problematization of migration as a social issue within the Greek society, and the emphasis is placed on different problems that these people face. And also the discussion in the parliament about legalization of immigrants is indicative of this turn. Also, the law of 2010, also known as Ragoussis law, reflected the intention of the Greek state for entering into a new migration policy era. It granted voting rights in local elections to legal migrants who held long-term residence. This law entitled second-generation migrants to Greek citizenship. And one can observe then the increasing politicization of the subject matter, which reaches its peak around 2012. Migration becomes increasingly a central point of political debate, becomes even the central point of campaigning for certain parties, mainly the ultra-right-wing ones like Laos and Golden Dawn. Of course, Ragoussis law was deemed as unconstitutional later, and the Greek citizenship continued to be based on the law of the blood rather than the law of the soil. Additionally, then aggressive policies were implemented, like deportations, the notorious sweep operations like Xenius Zeus, whereby the police was locating and arresting irregular migrants for the purpose of expulsion. The arrests were based on the color of the skin many times. And as one of the interviewees said in my research, the goal was not to control immigration, but the image that would be passed to the Greek society that the situation is under control. And also the long-term detention, which reached up to 18 months, strengthened the criminalization of the irregular immigrants. The maximum permissible length of detention had repeatedly been extended, and there is a common observation among scholars that detention functioned as a sanction, and that it was used in its disciplinary and punishment dimension. There were reports and policy briefs and, of course, criticism by NGOs that illustrates these serious operational problems and worrying living condition in detention centers like the notorious Amygdaleza and also police stations. And parallel to the internal operations, one of the main policies of the Greek government for addressing migration issues was the sealing of the borders. A major project that was undertaken in order to halt migration was to build a barbed wire fence along a 12.5 kilometer stretch land. This fence might have deterred people from crossing this particular border. However, this caused a dramatic increase of arrivals through Greek-Turkish sea borders. The fact that migrants and refugees were forced to take other routes resulted to increased numbers of deaths in the Mediterranean. And also traffickers were finding alternative and less patrolled routes for their victims. So the asylum system was in crisis and actually continues to be in crisis with unresolved structural problems that were intensified by the strict and repressive measures. Dublin regulation had several weaknesses, particularly in the absence of support mechanisms for asylum seekers. And this was evidenced in the case of MSS versus Belgium and Greece in 2011, whereby the European Court of Human Rights ruled that the asylum conditions in Greece and the legal and real guarantees for asylum were so bad that not only Greece violated the European Convention of Human Rights, but also Belgium, which sent the asylum seeker back to Greece. And the consequence of this landmark sentence was the suspension of the return of asylum seekers from the European countries with few exceptions. And the subsequent years, 2013 and 2014, are characterized by harsh government stance of new democracy against migrants and from the international outcry for racist violence in Greece and especially in Athens, and of course for the numerous incidents in the reception centers. Amnesty International was reporting on continuing human rights violations by members of the security forces, torture, ill treatment, and also Human Rights Watch on the abuse of immigrants by the Greek police in Athens. The dogma then that was dominating was we have to make their lives unbearable, as it was said by the chief of police. And additionally, border controls have been subjected to criticism, and there are reports revealing also pushbacks, known also to the European Commission, who chose not to intervene only after intense pressure. For example, a report of Human Rights Watch in the beginning of 2014 urged for the establishment of an inquiry into all allegations of collective expulsions, pushbacks, and other dangerous maneuvers by the Greek Coast Guard on Greece sea borders with Turkey, mentioning the deaths of people at the island of Armakonisi on January 20th, 2014, caused by what survivors alleged was a pushback operation in poor weather. And there was a turning point in 2015 because of the high numbers. More than 900,000 people crossed Greece. So I'm showing this slide. You can see the sea arrivals and the land arrivals. I'm showing this slide mainly for 2015 to see how different the number is, especially for sea arrivals. So the country was facing a crisis, the reception crisis, within a crisis, the economic one. The main entry point was the Eastern Aegean, as Evros was mostly sealed, and the Syriza-led coalition government followed a completely different rhetoric, then friendly to migrants and refugees. And the main political line was that pushbacks had to stop and that detention centers should be replaced with hospitality centers. The agenda, of course, was transformed. However, on a practical level, there weren't any important changes. Also, certain choices fell flat, like the one whereby the government didn't have any specific housing plans for those asylum seekers that they were set free. And while refugees were camping on squares and benches, an ill-advised statement came from the Minister of Migration, stating that these people are simply sunbathing. So the government supposed then that the only ethical and legal obligation, as Christopoulos is writing, towards the people that kept coming, was to ensure that they will enter and leave Greece safely, and that the country could not take any further responsibility. The refugee crisis also brought along the hotspot approach, which was an initial response of the European Commission to the exceptional flows. It was offered as a solidarity measure to the migratory pressures that countries with external borders of the EU were facing, like Italy and Greece especially in its eastern Aegean islands. And the objective was to provide these countries with operational support so that they can identify, register and fingerprint migrants and follow through asylum procedures, relocation and return operations. So in addition, the EU-Turkey statement that was signed in March 2016 imposed the clause of the geographical restriction, the asylum seekers' restriction of movement to the island that they first entered, which resulted to the overcrowding of the reception centers on the islands. The temporary character of these sites have made the living conditions unbearable, as after all, they proved to be a long-term state. Which brings me to the second part of the presentation, which is the EU context. And one cannot view and understand the Greek migration and border management practices outside the EU framework. In a certain extent, we could say that the stalemate of the situation that the Greek islands are facing is due to the EU political map in relation to migration management. And I'm referring to the expansion of detention centers, the intensification and militarization of border controls in the Mediterranean, the use of extraordinary measures, and the externalization of migration. So refugee camps, detention centers, processing zones, their very existence is not something peculiar. We are witnessing a normalization of the current status of border management. However, there's nothing normal or agreeable to the EU ideals. The living conditions of migrants and refugees in the hotspots of the Greek islands have been dangerous for the physical and mental health, as in several cases there has been lack of access to the very basics, such as heating, hot water, health services, and consequently there are immense challenges to water supply, sanitation, hygiene, promotion, and public health. With the unfolding situation and the developing securitization practices in the context of the neoliberal governmentality, atypical spaces and detached zones from the rest of the spatial and societal norm are being formed. There, the normal law does not apply. The establishment of zones of exception where human bodies are subjugated to institutes a space where normal politics and normal juridical order are excluded. The impassable biopolitical space of Agamben, of the detention camp, justifies in the eyes of the society and the political system out of the ordinary measures, classifying them as preventative, as the presence of migrants and refugees pose a danger to the security of the state. In the case of the encamped people, natural life is conditioned under the apparatuses and calculations of state power, transforming politics into biopolitics, as Foucault would say. And one of the most overcrowded and renowned hotspots was the Moria refugee camp on the island of Lesbos. While the capacity of Moria, which was burnt down in September 2020, was 3,000 people, there were over 19,000 people living in it. And according to members of civil society that have assisted refugees in the Moria camp, the minimum camp standards were not met. Like, for example, the number of latrines, the quantity of water per population, and of course, the outbreak of the pandemic posed an additional issue to the already problematic situation. The new Tepe, also known as Mavrovouni camp in Lesbos, that accommodated the refugees that were forced out of Moria camp because of the disastrous fire, has a hosting capacity of 10,000 people. This is the biggest in Europe. And currently, there is a dreadful situation at this camp, and UNHCR stated that there have been critical gaps in hygiene, sanitation, water supply, and health services in this new site. There has been inadequate electricity, water, and people could not warm up during the cold days of the winter, of course, exacerbating diseases and respiratory infections. Also, there are only a few showers with cold water. Most people wash themselves in water taps in the sea or with limited amount of water that they receive during their daily food distribution. And as people cannot take care of their personal hygiene, there is an increase of scabies incidents and occurrence of other diseases. The chemical toilets are not connected to water, and they are in horrendous state. A lot of them are very dirty and cannot be used. Médecins Sans Frontières have initiated an anti-tetanus vaccination program after children were also bitten by rats. And this picture brings to mind Agamben's political analysis, who puts in the epicenter Homo sacer, a figure deprived of all political rights and banished from the polis. It is a form of human life that is deprived from all legal protection. This figure stands as a metaphor for those excluded from official legal protection and reduced to a bare life state, such as refugees. He also draws links between refugee camps and concentration camps, and argues that within both, human beings can be deprived of their rights and prerogatives to such an extent that no act committed against them can appear as a crime. In this way, they are transformed into a bare life. In the same logic, border enforcements, have recently been the norm in many parts of the world. And there is an increasingly obvious eagerness to protect the aspects of social and political life and the identity of us from the others. Despite the impression that borders and walls and barriers and symbols have perished with decolonization and the end of the bipolar world, 9/11 events have resulted in a paradigm change in the study of borders and the treatment of borders as such. So more barbed wire fences, more walls, intensified surveillance are the new norm in the external borders of the EU, despite the evidence provided by scientific research that these measures won't halt migration. The current unfolding events with thousands of people, 50,000 since the external border was shut, dying at the shores of the Mediterranean validate this fact. According to the Missing Migrant Project of the International Organization of Migration, in 2020, there were 1,421 deaths in the Mediterranean. In 2019, there were 1,885 deaths, which are much smaller numbers than 2016, where 5,143 people lost their lives in the Mediterranean. These figures affirm the humanitarian disaster and the long-term failed migration and governance system in the EU. And one of the most heavily criticized agencies dealing with border controls by human rights activists and pro-migrant groups is the EU's Border and Coast Guard Agency, or else known as Frontex. The choice of certain extraordinary measures, this means out of the normal practices to tackle migration, conveys the message that this issue is a security threat, that this needs to be tackled urgently, and thereby socially constructing the issue as a security threat. For example, the sophistication of the operations coordinated by Frontex, the intelligence gathered prior to the operations, the number of states involved, the participation of some states of origin and transit through various agreements, and the existence of also of the central record of available technical equipment, and the increasing length of the operations puts them in a league of their own. Frontex is transforming into a super force. It is the strongest and the best financed agency in the history of the EU. This graph shows the massive growth of its budget until 2027. And according to the European Court of Auditors, for the next multi-annual financial framework in 2021 to 2027, the Commission has proposed the following: to create a standing corps of 10,000 border guards, made available by member states with executive powers to provide on-the-ground support, to increase Frontex's EU staff to 3,000 people by 2025, to provide a total of EU contribution of over 11 billion for the period that we're discussing, to finance the setting up of standing corps and the purchase of new equipment and the performance of additional tasks, and to provide financial support to equip and train national component of the European Border and Coast Guard in member states with the aim of enhancing their operational capacity. And this new regulation was adopted in November 2019 and came into force in December 2019. So therefore, we observe the emergence of a new migration map where the internal and external security intersect. States as traditional actors in the international system face new dangers, as they are called, in relation to sovereignty, identity, and borders. This interpretation of internal and external security is by no means a reflection of the growing threats in modern times, as Bigot is saying, Didier Bigot. It is the reduction in the level of acceptance of the other. It is an attempt to reassure that daily lives of security professionals and increase of police capacity to act. So the involvement of armed forces inside the national territory reshuffles the professional structures and blurs the boundaries between the domestic and the external fields of security, between the criminal and the enemy, between the civil protection in case of an emergency and civil defense in case of a threat, between the protection of public order, defense of the democratic order, and the state of war. This convergence of threats and risks is considered as the main justification for new structures and more cooperation between the agencies, internal as well as external, as well as a rationalizing of their budgets in a period of financial crisis for security affairs. And this brings me to my concluding remarks, and I want to share some of my research results. So based on the research, I have established that securitization of migration has been intensified after 2010. And apart from the Greek government techniques and the wider securitization of migration in the EU through the institutionalization and development of various practices and tools, there are two factors that contributed to the intensification of securitization, and this is the economic crisis and the role of the far right. The economic crisis exacerbated already existing issues, and migration has been mostly perceived and addressed as a security matter against parameters of social life, like, for example, health, public safety, identity, and economy. The dichotomy of we and they, Greek citizens and foreigners, as a rhetorical construction has been often been used in the context of discussion about the economic crisis. This construction of the migrant as the non-systemic and problematic element created an anti-immigration rhetoric that swelled significantly in times of economic crisis. And parallel to the economic crisis and interrelated to it, the ascendance of the far right contributed to the framing of migration as a security threat. For example, one of the characteristics of the rhetoric of the Golden Dawn was the persistence on the criminal profile of the illegal immigrants, they were an economic threat, a national risk, a risk to public safety. And when one looks into practices, an overall comment can be made. It is that the main goal of the Greek strategy has been to convince migrants to avoid entering Greece, and that migration and security have been inextricably connected in the implemented model of migration policy in Greece. And this can be regarded through the lens of external securitization, which is the entry, admission, and practice at borders, and internal securitization like integration, removal, detention. Most importantly, Greece had to be compatible with the broader European context. For participation in the Schengen system, it had to implement specific legal terms relating to border controls, visa policy, and the fight against illegal migration. And what the research as a whole showed is that securitization as a process did not follow a linear course, but there were fluctuations. It cannot be observed as an unchanging process. There were what I call the securitization fractures in the securitization process, and they were emanating from legislative or other political moves. And with this, I have ended my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Foteini. This was a very, very interesting presentation on a very topical issue. And I will give now the floor to Dimitris. In the meantime, you can start posing your questions in the Q&A space. Dimitris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Foteini, for a very informative and very rich presentation. You covered a lot of ground here, so many thanks for that. What I'm going to do is basically spend a little bit of time emphasizing some of the issues that Foteini raised in her presentation. So I'm going basically to focus on 4 things that she mentioned. So these are basically remarks that emanate from my own work on the topic, and of course, you know, these also these points are also in reference to what Foteini presented. Let me start by talking a little bit about securitization theory and how what it means, what it is, and how it's applied in the case of Greece and migration. This is a theory that Foteini is using in her own research. I have also used in my own research. So one of the main elements, one of the key notions in securitization theory is what the academics such as Buzan, for example, call state of exception. What this means is that usually every securitization of any issue that has been securitized has more or less 4 things that are constantly observed, that are present across the board. The first is the securitizing actor. And when we talk about securitizing actors, usually we refer to political elites, such as governments or government officials. Securitization also needs a threat, and threats can be found, you know, across the social and political spectrum. In this case, we're talking about migration, which is primarily a social phenomenon that has been a part of human existence since, you know, the dawn of mankind, essentially. However, migration tends to be perceived as a threat. The third element that is important in securitization processes is a referent object, as Buzan and his colleagues say. And by referent object, we mean something that is being threatened by the threat that we previously identified. There are several things that a securitizing actor can raise attention to. Sometimes it's the economy. Migrants take jobs of the native population. Some other times it's criminality. So high migration numbers bring rise and increase in criminality numbers. There's also the issue of public order and security, such as terrorism. All of these referent objects are important and play a role in securitization processes, and of course they are emphasized by securitizing actors. And finally, securitization processes also need an audience. Securitizing actors are trying to convince an audience, usually the public opinion, that the specific threat, migration in our case, poses an existential threat to one or more of the referent objects that we identified. Foteini talked about the securitization of migration in Greece in the last 30 years or so, and of course he correctly identified a number of fluctuations, so it's not a linear process, it has ebbs and flows essentially. However, my question is, and of course we don't have to address and answer this question, but it's more of a food for thought kind of remark here. Given that migration has been understood and governed predominantly through the security lens since the early 1990s in Greece, can we still talk about migration as an exception, the way that it's managed and governed as an exception? Or maybe should we admit that maybe the way in which migration is governed, that is through the security lens, is actually the norm and not the exception? Three more things here. Foteini also talked about the key role, the key importance of the early 2000s in the securitization processes in Greece. She talked about how our image of who is the unwanted migrant changed in the early 2000s, and this is not a coincidence that this change happened in the early 2000s. This shift in who we consider in Greece the unwanted migrant coincides with a change in the country of origin of migrants coming to Greece. So from migrants coming predominantly from the Balkan countries and Eastern Europe, that were the main populations arriving in Greece in the 1990s, we increasingly started receiving and hosting people from the Middle East, Africa, and Asia as well. At the same time, this shift in who is the unwanted migrant also coincides with increasingly mixed migration flows. What we mean by that is that the drivers of migration became, since the early 2000s, increasingly complex. The boundaries between economic and political motives of migration started becoming increasingly blurred. What we mean here is that a person might not necessarily be leaving their own country for strictly political or personal safety and security reasons, which would essentially qualify that person for asylum in Greece. A person might have lost their job as a result, for example, of new power dynamics in their place of residence. And there are, of course, several cases of people who after they arrived in Greece, they mentioned reasons of losing their jobs in Syria, for example, as a result of ISIS taking over and changing all the rules of the labor market. However, how would we consider that person and their motives for migration? Would it be predominantly economic or political and personal security reasons for migrating? Two more things here to mention. There are two very important parameters in the securitization of migration in Greece that I think we should also emphasize and keep in mind. The first one is the diachronic rivalry between Greece and Turkey. We're talking about the tense bilateral relations between the two countries, which is a very important parameter in the securitization of migration in Greece and the EU. This is basically what I mean by the diachronic rivalry is that international relations dynamics between the two countries, tense bilateral relations between the two countries, and the casus belli condition that exists in the relations between the two countries spills over into how migration is understood and managed in Greece. Essentially, what this means in practical terms is that there is a conviction on behalf of Greece, consecutive Greek governments, that Turkey is instrumentally using migration and migrants to gain and leverage concessions from Greece and the EU. And of course, one can here use the illustration of the 2015-16 refugee crisis, as well as the recent flare-up of the crisis at the Evros border in February and March 2020. This is an important dimension of the securitization that we need to keep in mind. And the second important dimension here is the securitization of humanitarianism, the second conviction predominantly among security professionals in Greece, that humanitarianism plays the role of a pull factor for migrants in Greece. And of course, this is not a unique condition in the securitization of migration in Greece. This is also a conviction that we see among security professionals in Italy as well. The Salvini, the Ministry of Interior in Italy under Salvini tried to ban NGOs from providing search and rescue operations in Greece. And of course, this leads to delegitimization of NGOs in Greece. And a clear illustration of what we mean by this securitization of humanitarianism is the closure of the Pikpa Center, the village of All Together, also known as the village of All Together on Lesbos Island. And of course, to conclude here, after having mentioned all of these unique and not so unique parameters in how migration has been securitized in Greece, a question that emerges, which again, we don't have to answer or address today, but it's more meant as a food for thought, is whether desecuritization of migration is possible at the Greek-Turkish border under these circumstances. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dimitri, for the comments. Foteini, do you want to respond before start answering questions from the audience?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, Lambrini. Dimitri, thank you very much for all the comments and for all the gaps that you filled. Of course, the issue of the instrumentalization of migration by Erdogan at Evros last year as a retaliation measure, exerting pressure on the EU and destabilizing Greece, is a very important element. And but we have to see also EU's instrumentalization of migration along the years. And I mean about externalization of migration, like agreements that have been signed between the EU and or individual countries between and other countries, like Libya and Italy, for example, in order to create buffer states. So it is a long-term, long-standing technique of the EU as well, instrumentalizing and weaponizing also migrants. Now for the securitization framework, it is very interesting that you say it, because I have seen also in my research that there is a way of desecuritizing. Of course, I mean, it's very difficult, and if only, I mean, we could only perhaps create the fractures that I talked about. For example, the non-governmental organizations that you talked about can cause these kinds of fractures in the securitization process, like the work of Doctors Without Frontiers, the Human Rights Watch, the Greek Council for Refugees. These organizations' intervention in migration issues, either through texts or pressure to governments or through actions, contributed to the desecuritization of migration and continue to do so, which means that they transfer the issue of migration out of the framework of security, promoting it as a human rights issue. And of course, this offers a counter framework of discussion and management of migration in Greece, which is not defined by security rationale. So they function in a way as a counterweight. And within this framework, we have the human rights rhetoric, either when it's referring to the rights of refugees in the detention centers or the rights of inclusion in the Greek society. Now, if we can speak about the securitization in the context of the Greek-Turkish relations, there we have to put for sure into the discussion the EU. For example, we have to see what is going to happen with the EU-Turkey agreement, and how we're going to deal with returns to Turkey and how this system is going to work. So only by putting in the discussion the EU, only then we can speak about the securitized framework, yes, and management. I think that, and also you talked about the state of exception. Yes, I think that the denial to acknowledge normality as a constant state of exception hinders us from acknowledging the state of exception itself. So there is the permanence of the temporary in a way. I mean, there is a perpetuation of the situation that there is no way out at the moment. So we have a continuous state of temporariness. These exceptional places that become permanent. And this brings in mind also what Walter Benjamin was saying in Homo Sacer's work, that the tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of exception in which we live is the rule. Yeah, we can't speak of exception anymore, but of a continuous state of a temporary state in a way. I think this sounds as a paradox, but I think that's what the worry of Agamben himself is, that we have a perpetuation of these temporary states. He was saying that Hitler, when he announced the state of emergence, this state of emergence ended 12 years later. So we're not sure when this state of emergence regarding our borders is going to end. But most importantly, I think we need to understand in Greece that we're not going to be a transit state only. We have to understand that maybe these people that came here, they're here to stay. So the framework of the discussion might have to change.